Welcome to the final panel before the closing bell. We don't have very long. We have about 23 minutes to be exact, so we're not going to actually be able to take any questions, which I know is not ideal. But as you can see, we do have 4 panelists here. The panel is called The Case for Investing in Russia. And though I would say this anyway, this time I can say it honestly, that we have 4 really experienced and knowledgeable panelists to talk on the subject. So I'm going to start with the CEO of MTS, Russia's largest cell phone operator, Andrei Dubovskov. Thank you very much for joining us. I can give the corporate perspective to my left here, Guff from Siguler. Guff, one of the very first private equity investors in Russia. To my right, Mattias Westman from Prosperity Capital, also one of the first portfolio investors in Russia, perhaps the largest portfolio investor in Russia. And finally, Kirill Dmitriev from the Russia Direct Investment Fund, a sovereign wealth fund in Russia that co-invests alongside private equity in the Russian market. Keeping in mind the title of this panel, maybe I start with you, Kirill. In less than 2 minutes, tell me, why should I invest in Russia?
I'll just continue with what first Prime Minister Shuvalov was talking about, which is an incredible growth story of Russia. So Vice Prime Minister mentioned a couple of figures during the lunch today. The GDP per capita grew 10 times in the last 12 years. And realistically, Russian GDP was 1/20th of the United States in 2000, and now it's 1/3 of the United States. So there is an incredible growth happening in Russia in all sorts of sectors. And government is really helping certain industries grow. We talked about healthcare. There is 0 tax rate on healthcare in Russia because government wants this sector to grow. And it makes sense because middle class tripled in Russia in the last 5 years, and many more people will need good healthcare and are capable to pay for it. So there are tremendous growth sectors and very clear government policy that is supporting growth in those sectors. Russian Direct Investment Fund was created to co-invest with the leading investors in the world. In just less than a year, we've done deals of 1.5 billion, out of which 400 million came from us and 1.1 from co-investors. So there are great success stories happening. I'm sure Guff will talk about EPAM. I still have 10 seconds to go, and I encourage everybody to come into Russia because there are great opportunities there and really very unique growth opportunities that are very much lacking in the world right now.
Thank you very much, Kirill. So, Drew, you were named there.
Okay.
From the private equity perspective, the single best argument for investing in Russia, from your viewpoint, would be what?
Something that very few people know, which is track record. If you go to a public website, EBRD it's a global parastatal development bank. Russia's a board member and one of the investors in the bank. Go and look at their returns for private equity in Russia. And what you'll see is that a very little known fact, private equity returns in Russia are higher than private equity returns in other emerging markets and higher than all developed markets. Now, it's a small industry so far, but the Russian economy is relatively new.
As a percentage of GDP, what private equity in Russia?
This is one of the issues. So private, and one of the reasons why Kirill exists, or his fund exists, is that if you look around the world, generally private equity is around 2% of GDP. In Russia, it's 0.2%. So it's 10 times less and a lot of room for growth. And the fact that the government now has this co-investment fund is a good thing because now you've got the number 1 guy in the country, the number 2 guy in the country, number 3 guy in the country talking about what return on private capital means, what return on private equity means, and it means they get it. And you can't say that for every other big emerging market.
Mattias, from the portfolio investment perspective, I mean, we've already heard the macroeconomic story from Kirill. What's the case for investing in Russia?
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned this with the track records because portfolio investment has also had a very good track record and our funds have generated very substantial returns over time. But I think often people get a little bit lost in discussing issues of macroeconomy and so on. It's so big and growing this much. I mean, these macro drivers have been substantial for the Russian economy for sure. And the commodity cycle, of course, is also an enormous driver. But what we've found as portfolio investors, we own, after all, parts of businesses. And these businesses have gone through and are going through an enormous transformation. They used to be Soviet production units, ministries, with very, very poor productivity and so on. But now we've seen over these years privatization, new owners, real entrepreneurs who are building businesses and creating wonderful, profitable, cash flow generating businesses. People think Russia is different from other places. It's not different. You would recognize these companies. Don't get lost in the politics or all these discussions about if the GDP is up or down a little bit and so on. Focus on the companies. That's what we do. We buy relatively large stakes for a portfolio investor in these companies. We deal with the management teams and the owners to try to make them more valuable, to try to improve the corporate governance, to improve transparency. And that generates a lot of value over time.
A little postscript to Mattias' statement there. He said that they've done well. Well, in fact, between 2000 and 2010, Morningstar said that one of his Russia funds returned more money to its investors than any other managed fund in the world. That's according to Morningstar, so just a little
Thank you.
paid advertisement there. I want to ask Andrei about, from the perspective of MTS, not so much how you benefited from the consumer story, the rise of the Russian consumer, because I think that's pretty clear, and we heard Kirill talk about that as well. But there is a perception that Russian companies maybe are outside of Russia, a bit maybe primitive in the way that they go about business. I'm guessing you don't see it that way.
Не ожидал такого вопроса, довольно интересный вопрос, но тем не менее.
I mean in terms of using technology to increase productivity to get the kind of returns that Mattias is talking about.
Да, смотрите, российские телекоммуникации за последние 20 лет прошли громадный путь. Мы начали буквально с нуля, и сейчас с точки зрения технологической оснащенности, с точки зрения перспектив нашего развития, с точки зрения используемых нами технологий, с точки зрения новых услуг и сервисов, которые мы внедряем в нашу жизнь, безусловно, никакого отставания или никакой самой более или менее ощутимой разницы между российскими телекоммуникациями и телекоммуникациями развитых стран не наблюдается. Наблюдается определенная разница, связанная с доходами на душу населения, наблюдается определенная разница, связанная с проникновением смартфонов, дата-генерирующих устройств. Но это, безусловно, вопрос времени, как скоро российские телекоммуникации закроют этот гэп. Для примера могу сказать, что уровень проникновения смартфонов и дата-генерирующих устройств в российских телекоммуникациях это примерно 20-25% в зависимости от оператора, в то время как ведущие мировые операторы, наши партнеры, например, такая как группа Vodafone, демонстрируют этот уровень порядка 40-50%. Но, повторюсь, это вопрос коммерческой политики, вопрос года, двух, и я вас уверяю, что в обозримом будущем даже эта разница будет снивелирована.
Mattias, let me ask you if we got to talk about some of the elephants in the room. So if you look at the Russian stock market, it's one of the world's cheapest, right? Mm-hmm. Price to earnings ratio this year expected to come in at about 5. Next year estimated to be about 4. That's way lower than other BRIC countries. Mm. That's because what, investors just don't get it outside of Russia?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of problems. I mean, I think one of them, of course, is the general fear in a lot of markets, and they don't want to deal with something as, peripheral and maybe a little bit hard to understand as Russia is. But the other more fundamental problem is that they tend, like I said, focusing on politics, discussing, Putin's personality and whatever he wants to do and so on, instead of focusing on these companies that are improving productivity, improving services, introducing modern technology, and becoming more profitable. I don't quite know why this kind of attitude is more prevalent in Russia, partly because Russia used to be, or the Soviet Union used to be some kind of adversary maybe. But we are seeing anyway that people who have more contact, more trade with Russia and so on, they start understanding that profits are being made, companies are really improving and productivity is rising. So that's what people need to learn in order to break through this risk. Plus, of course, there's the actual functioning of the stock market has been fairly poor. And now there's a big program, Moscow as an international financial center, to try to improve that and make the markets accessible for a larger pool of
The
investors.
central depository, and so investors, foreign investors, will have direct access to the
Yes.
bond market starting
And
in
eventually also
January
the stock market.
in 2014 is the expectation. So they won't have to buy into your fund; they can buy directly.
By the way,
I gave him.
Wait, that's two paid political advertisements.
No, that was actually one. I was taking one away from him there. Look, I want to ask about the private equity space, right? Because he just brought up and you already established that, or maybe it was done for you, that the reason why the Russia Direct Investment Fund exists is to deal with this perceived, if we didn't talk about this, we can talk about it now, perceived issue of risk in Russia, partner risk, that, if you go in there, things might be great, but maybe they don't work out, so maybe it's good to be partnered up with the Kremlin. I know when we were talking before this, you were saying that it's actually not, there is no real risk in Russia, or a big risk, as big as it's perceived. It's a perceived risk. What's your experience been? You've done 40 private equity deals?
40 investments. I can say we had a problem, major problem. Every company has minor problems, but
Sure.
major problem in one of the 40, which is pretty good track record. For any private equity group, that's a pretty darn good track record. And also, you look at what's happened in stocks. Very few cases of Russian public companies at all that have had fraud issues once they're public.
or gone under but because of debt.
You will see that.
None.
Chinese companies have had that issue. There have been other emerging market companies, but Russian companies have not
I should
had.
just point out, you also
have not had
invest
that.
in other BRIC peers.
We
so you
invest in
haven't
other
been-
BRIC countries, so I've got a basis for comparison. But one of the issues that Kuriel's fund solves is partner risk or perceived partner risk. But that's really not what makes a good deal or a bad deal, is whether or not you partner with the RDIF. It does help bring capital in. It's very catalytic. But as he knows and as we know, good companies are going to rise and fall on how good their managements are, how fast they're attacking the market, how good their people are when you're the human resource department finding the best professionals in Russia to work for your company. And those are the factors, and governance. Those are the factors that really determine whether a company makes it or not.
And you would argue that obviously a success story for your business has been bringing one Russian company public this year on the New York Stock Exchange.
Yeah, we did. So since we're here at the stock exchange, it's definitely worth talking about.
That you can actually go in, you can invest in a Russian company in that space and make it public and bring it all the way to New York.
6 years ago, we invested in a company that was hiring Russian software programmers to work for foreign global multinationals. And 5 years ago, everybody said, well, I want Indian programmers, I want Israeli programmers, I'm not so interested in Russia. Today, that company is 8,000 programmers across Russia and the region, and the CIS region. It went public on the New York Stock Exchange in February. We looked at London, we looked at other venues. The deepest, best pool for technology is in New York. Compared it against NASDAQ. New York Stock Exchange, very competitive now against NASDAQ, I will say. And it's been one of the best performing IPOs this year on the New York Stock Exchange. The stock is up about 70%. When we invested, they had something like 15 million in revenue this year. The public research analysts will tell you that they'll do $420 million in revenue. But what that means is that the new digital economy is linking people like never before. And now you have Google, Microsoft, SAP, Sberbank using programmers everywhere to do their work. And when they are going to use complex programming solutions, you can now go to Russia for complex programming solutions. And the capital flow, we have satisfied investors from a private deal. We'll return that capital. They'll most likely they'll come back and they'll do it again. So you see the whole cycle from the private side come back out on the public side.
Maybe I can jump in on that, because one of the really strong points of Russia is also its very well-educated workforce. I mean, in many emerging markets, you do have a problem that most people are coming back basically off the farm and are not used to mathematics in a modern life. We've found in many of our companies, not necessarily software companies or IT companies in themselves, but we found that many of them have very competent a very competent workforce that is able to introduce modern technology. You have a lot of intelligent people running your software systems in MTS. You've been able to, in a food retailer like Magnet, you have a very sophisticated logistics system distributing, groceries to 7,000 stores. You have oil companies where they can introduce modern technology into field management and so on. This is a true strength of the Russian economy and something that will help Russia also, surpass this kind of middle-income trap as is known, and probably help it quicker become a really modern economy. And that generates a lot of returns, of course, for investors.
Let me just ask you, I think it's probably fair to say that when many people think about investing in Russia, they think about Gazprom and the big blue chips, they think energy. Where do you see the best opportunities right now?
Well, we believe that there are several, key approaches. One is opportunities that are based on emerging middle class. And we talked about healthcare today, but for example, when I was with Delta Private Equity before I joined this, we made excellent investments in television, investments in financial services. So lots of companies are growing very well because middle class is growing, and therefore, you get tremendous benefit. Another key sector that I see is infrastructure, because Russia really is heavily underinvested in infrastructure, and there are tremendous opportunities, and the government is also thinking about some approaches to attract money into infrastructure. So we believe there will be huge opportunities in pay roads, even in airports, in some really big infrastructural areas, including Russian Far East region, because that's a big secret of Russia, that region is really poised for development, and there will be major opportunities there. So, I can mention logistics, agriculture, and specific companies, but really it's around middle class, it's about infrastructure, and it's about some really underdeveloped areas such as Russian Far East that are very attractive.
And just, I know we were chatting earlier today of the deals that RDIF has done so far, at least some have been in medical care.
Yeah, so we've done a deal.
We've got two deals coming up, one in medical care
and one is automotive component manufacturing. And again, we are working with some of the largest private equity funds in the US who not only bring their money, but also technology. And they see that lots of Russian companies are still not 100% as effective as some of their counterparts in other countries. But that's an opportunity for them to invest and make really a much nicer return. So we see all sorts of non-oil gas sectors that are going to be really growing very quickly, and that provide returns of 20% and more a year of value creation.
Andrei, I want to ask you, what's the single biggest misperception about Russian companies? And maybe the same thing is the biggest argument for investing in Russia.
С моей точки зрения, один из основных таких нереальных, но воображаемых конфузов состоит в том, что многие инвесторы опасаются, скажем так, неправильного, непрозрачного законодательства, в первую очередь отраслевого. Но на примере телекоммуникаций могу сказать, что это, безусловно, не так. И немножко углубляясь дальше в эту тему, для примера могу сказать о том, как с точки зрения законодательства были обозначены условия получения лицензии 3G в Российской Федерации. Мы внимательно смотрели, как развиваются эти услуги, эти технологии в европейских странах, на американском континенте, в Азии. Очень хорошо, что представители операторов, представители телекоммуникационного сообщества были привлечены к выработке решений по отраслевому законодательству в этой области. И в итоге, например, в отличие от европейских стран, лицензии в Российской Федерации были разыграны с минимальной платой за сами лицензии, за сами частоты. Это позволило операторам вкладывать очень серьезные, большие деньги непосредственно в строительство, сетей 3G, и, соответственно, далее через налогооблагаемую базу государство получало соответствующие налоги, вливания в бюджет. Такой метод, к сожалению, наверное, для наших коллег европейских не сработал. Как вы знаете, там огромные средства были потрачены именно на получение разрешений, на получение бумаги с подписью, на получение лицензий. И, соответственно, эта отрасль до сих пор во многих европейских странах остается недоинвестированной. Я также очень доволен тем, и, надеюсь, мои коллеги по рынку, другие операторы, что лицензии на сотовую связь 4-го поколения в Российской Федерации также были выданы, исходя вот из таких прерогатив. У нас есть очень серьезное обязательство по инвестированию в строительство сетей 4-го поколения, и это очень правильно. Неправильно было бы, если бы мы потратили очень большие деньги на, так сказать, на разрешение, на лицензии, ну и так далее. Вот конкретный пример, как, с моей точки зрения, наше государство правильно поступает, подходя к отраслевому законодательству. Ну и, наверное, на этом примере неплохо показан мой ответ на вопрос, сказать, что является там недоразумением, да.
Mattias, I want
Или dissatisfaction. Там.
Yeah, I just want to, if we take the whole issue of the law there, you know, we've been talking about infrastructure. You mentioned the central depository, which is in the process of sort of bringing access to international investors. But I want to ask you, you know, I mean, you talk about how corporate governance has improved, you know, sort of night and day between when you started in the mid-90s. What's your experience been when you don't agree with what a company's doing and you go to court? Or can you even go to court? How does?
Yeah, I mean, corporate governance is a big issue in investing in Russia. I mean, we have almost 20 years of experience in Russia, and we've had some.
It doesn't keep you away, is the.
We've had some difficult moments for sure, but I think people also mix it up with political risk. Generally, there's no bad will from the government, so there's not really political risk. What happens is that, and the laws are even more or less okay mostly, but sometimes they're not enforced properly. And so, you know, there has been breaches of corporate governance from time to time, and we've dealt with that very systematically in our company. We started a long time ago, more than 10 years ago. But I would say at that time, we used to lose every time in court. Now we still lose.
Back in the 90s.
Back in the 90s. Now we still lose half, but we win half. So there's been a market improvement. It's also not so different again. I mean, you do have problems sometimes to get the law properly enforced, but if you have an issue, the first thing you try to do is, of course, discuss it with the company to try to make sure that they understand what they need to do in order to become a more respected company. If that does not work, then you may have to go to court. Often you can find some negotiated solution. But the court system, they're getting experience. You have to remember again, there was no civil law system really in the Soviet Union. So they lacked a lot of experience with the judges and so on. But there's a huge difference between now or 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
You've won in court.
We do win quite fairly frequently now.
Gotcha.
And they, you know, important also, I mean, people think everything is so mysterious and that it would be dangerous. But in general, you know, Russians don't take it personally.
And the interesting thing is, we've seen recently London used as a place for some legal issues to be resolved. And I think counterintuitively for some people, when they look at Russia, actually it's been the Russian companies that have won in arbitration.
Many times,
It's not always the sort of perception that the Russian companies are these. You know.
No, I mean, I would say on the whole, most Russian companies are well managed and don't breach corporate governance. But when they do, you know, we as shareholders, and I'm sure you've had those situations also, you know, need to put our foot down to both to correct that specific situation, but also to make sure that people understand their responsibilities. And that leads, you know, in the end, to much higher valuations. So it benefits all Russian companies to put peer pressure on those who misbehave.
Sure, I'm going to give you the final word. The case for investing in Russia. What haven't we talked about here?
Well, Ryan, I have to say, you've covered most of the highlights. So as not to belabor it before the closing bell.
We have the closing bell ahead of us. Thank you very much for listening to this panel. Please thank the panelists. And I'd also like to thank the New York Stock Exchange for being the host of this very useful exercise, and the Russian government for sending a delegation so that this could happen.